As a PhD in medical biology from the School of Medicine, I was invited by journalist Ava to participate in an interview about the research project I am working on. This project is funded by Werner Gauss Biotechnology Company and is called the Resurrection Team, consisting of 4 people, including Nick Kleizoy and her partner Frank. It all started with an experiment by Zoe. She discovered that rapidly growing B-cell tumors could actually accelerate neuron regeneration, thereby creating a resurrection serum. By using a pulse distribution cabinet to conduct electricity and activate the serum to stimulate brain neurons, it is possible to bring people back from the brink of death, significantly increasing the chances of survival. As Frank said, everyone should have a second chance, but they won't know that this project will affect their entire lives. At night, Zoe fell into a nightmare. In the dim apartment, chaos reigned, and from the sea of fire at the end of the hallway, several pitch-black hands emerged, scaring Zoe awake immediately. She had been plagued by this nightmare for decades, and could only find peace of mind through her Catholic faith. Frank was also aware of her situation, and reassured her that her personal life would not affect the progress of the experiment. At the project seminar, Clay put forward a major hypothesis, which was initially a joke, but caught everyone's attention. Frank immediately ordered the experiment to begin. This time, the subject was a dog that had died from cataracts. The serum was injected into the brain, and Zoe removed all conductive metal accessories and pulled the switch, but nothing happened. Frank ordered an increase in voltage and tried again, but still, nothing occurred. Ava suddenly noticed the dog's ear twitch, but the monitor showed no readings, initially thought to be a muscle spasm. Unexpectedly, the dog suddenly leaped up and barked loudly at everyone. No one could believe it. The experiment had truly succeeded. Even more strangely, the dog's cataracts had somehow healed on their own, and everything still required further research. Considering the ethical implications, this experiment absolutely could not be disclosed to the outside world. The jubilant crowd had no idea that the ceiling-mounted surveillance had already leaked all the secrets. The resurrected dog was behaving oddly. It had been silent and withdrawn since coming back to life. It refused to eat anything, leaving Zoe with mixed feelings. She wasn't sure if the dog had agreed to be pulled back from death into reality, but Frank was more open-minded, believing that as long as it could help humanity, it was worth it. Engrossed in their conversation, neither of them noticed that the dog had become unusual. Late at night, it quietly climbed onto Zoe's bed and stared at her all night long. But come daylight, it returned to its lethargic state. Nick and Clay argued about whether the dog retained memories from before its death. Frank proposed a theory supporting that the pineal gland in the brain could produce dimethyltryptamine. It is released in large quantities before a person dies, causing hallucinations. However, Mr. Zuo felt that this conclusion was too generalized. His long-standing devotion to Catholicism led him to believe that beyond science, there is a distinction between heaven and hell. He explained that science and religion are essentially the same thing through the theory of energy fields. The role of dimethyltryptamine is to allow the soul to persist and find its belonging, thus being chosen by either heaven or hell. In any case, life and death are topics that can never be fully understood. When the dog was put into the MRI machine for dynamic range imaging, the serum that should have been completely absorbed by the body was still present in the dog's body. The brainstem activity was also extremely abnormal, with hypothyroidism. At this time, the dog was filled with uncontrollable aggression. At night, Clay was on duty several times, but suddenly heard noises coming from the dog's room. The room was in chaos. The dog cage was wide open, but the dog was nowhere to be seen. After searching, Clay was almost attacked by the snarling dog. The reassembled group began to question the authenticity of the incident. Even if it could get out of the cage, how could it reach the snacks in the cupboard? Frank recorded the dog's condition. So far, its brain was forming new neural pathways at an incredible speed. The reasons for all this were unknown, but Frank was running out of time. The project details were leaked by someone and reached the principal's ears. Such a dangerous experiment clearly crossed the school's boundaries. The Gauss Biotech Company also immediately stopped funding, sending people to confiscate all research data, samples, and access cards. Since their experiment violated the funding agreement, years of hard work were all considered the company's intellectual property. Zoe was the first to suspect Ava, but all the recordings were left in the lab, and she had no strong motive. Regardless, Frank proposed to conduct one last experiment to prove that her success was replicable. The company would only collect all the equipment the next day, leaving them with only 12 hours. Zoe had already made backups and Ava had access to the lab, so they decided to act immediately. Ava successfully tricked the gatekeeper and let everyone into the building through the back door. Nick was in charge of controlling the surveillance, and Clay was responsible for preparing the body. This time, the subject was still a dog. After the serum was injected, they were just waiting for Zoe to flip the switch. However, even the most meticulous plans can have oversights. Zoe forgot to remove her ring, causing the switch to explode and short-circuit. Amidst the flickering lights, Frank only found Zoe's electrocuted body. Nick immediately assisted by injecting adrenaline. Frank continuously performed CPR, and Clay brought over the AED, but it was all in vain. Everyone had to accept the fact that Zoe had already left them. However, Frank was different. He couldn't bring himself to remove Zoe's engagement ring, and a crazy idea formed in his mind. When everyone saw him carrying Zoe to the operating table, they realized what he intended to do. Everyone thought he was crazy. This was a human being, and neither morality nor law would allow him to do such a thing. But Frank was determined, and he no longer cared about anything else, so everyone had to agree. As the syringe was inserted into the brain, Ava immediately pulled down the switch, but Zoe did not come back to life. Nick adjusted the parameters and tried again, but still nothing happened. Before Frank could order another attempt, Nick suddenly noticed the missing security guard. Everyone hurriedly hid and narrowly escaped danger, only to turn around and find that Zoe had already sat up straight. Her eyes were vacant and her expression was dazed. She suddenly turned and grabbed Frank's wrist. After a thorough check, Frank realized he had really succeeded. Ava asked Zoe about her experience of coming back to life, which left her deeply shaken. So Frank had to reassure her. In the CT images, Zoe's neuronal reactions were extremely intense. Just like the dog situation, Nick explained. The human brain is developed to less than 10%, but Zoe's brain neural responses showed that her entire brain was operating at high speed. In this state, even water couldn't predict what might happen. Zoe also realized this because she could actually hear Frank's inner thoughts. The ballpoint pen on the table could also move according to his will. Zoe could even fully predict what Frank was going to say, just as he opened his mouth. This really frightened Frank. He feigned shock and hurried to find others to discuss it, but Zoe just slightly focused her mind. She easily heard the thoughts of everyone, and everyone felt something was off about him. His fingers also had strange black marks that couldn't be washed off. With a slight mental movement, the mirror suddenly shattered, reflecting two completely different faces. The desire for slaughter was rising. At this moment, a snarling dog suddenly appeared behind him, clearly unaware of the terrifying entity it was provoking. With a wail, its soul was able to rest in peace once more. So he immediately went to seek help from Frank, as he could feel himself undergoing a transformation. The terrifying part was that after his death, he found himself trapped in a nightmare, year after year, endlessly. That place was undoubtedly hell. Frank could only inject him with a sedative to let him have a good sleep. However, once his subconscious was out of control during deep sleep, it directly dragged Ava into the nightmare. A strange little girl signaled her to keep quiet, and the next moment, a charred hand grabbed her tightly. Waking up from the nightmare, Ava ran away in a state of collapse. But the burn marks on her arm reminded everyone that this was not just a dream. Frank exclaimed that it was impossible. Apart from him and Zoe, no one should know the content of this dream because it was the traumatic memory that Zoe had experienced. When she was a child, the apartment she lived in caught fire inexplicably, and all the neighbors died tragically. Ava speculated that it was due to the dimethyltryptamine secreted before death, which trapped Zoe in a nightmare, making Frank feel as if he was facing a formidable enemy, and he immediately began researching. Nick also unexpectedly discovered the alarming fact that they had been hacked. To a case, it turned out that they had been under surveillance for a long time, which led to the project's leak. And the recent human experiment was also fully recorded by surveillance. Undoubtedly, the company's personnel were on their way. Frank immediately ordered everyone to pack up, find the dog, and leave quickly. Unfortunately, they had no way to get out alive. As Zoe sank into her dream, she strangely floated in mid-air. When she opened her eyes, the black pupils signaled the subversion of her dark personality. The isolated Nick was the first to encounter the elusive Zoe, who unexpectedly confessed her love to him. To regain a sense of normalcy, but Nick was not that kind of person. His noble success angered Zoe, who had spent her life doing good and repenting, only to make up for the mistakes of her childhood, yet still ended up in hell after death. Although Nick kept reminding them that they could help Zoe, he no longer needed it. He wanted everyone to understand what kind of existence resurrection truly was. Nick was instantly locked inside a metal cabinet. Under his desperate pleas, the metal cabinet compressed and contracted, taking Nick's life. But that wasn't the end. Everyone searched for Nick, but to no avail. They came to ask Zoe, and he only said that Nick went to the bathroom. Clay didn't believe it at all, since he had just come out of the bathroom. And there was no sign of anyone. He had enough, and was about to call the police, but amidst the electrical fluctuations, the phone line suddenly went dead. Clay exclaimed that it was impossible, because with the emergency system in place, the phone should never go dead no matter what happens. Even more terrifying, all the exits were rendered inoperative due to the power outage. At this moment, it truly seemed like there was no way out. Ava was completely unaware that, in such a situation, one should never be alone. Although she was in the same room with Zoe, could she really be sure that the person sitting across from her could still be called human? Ava immediately stood up to leave, but Zoe unexpectedly voiced her thoughts. The confrontation between the two women was quickly interrupted by the return of the two others. Ava pointed out that Zoe was the last person to see Nick. Clay also broke down emotionally, loudly questioning Zoe about what she had done to Nick, but the pen in his hand suddenly plunged deep into his throat. He could finally confirm that Zoe was the one causing all the trouble behind the scenes, but he couldn't utter a word. The pen lodged deep in his throat caused him to suffocate to death. The remaining two finally realized that Zoe had completely changed into a different person, and the lights went out. All the furniture was actually under Zoe's control. All the furniture lifted and dropped, instantly knocking the two unconscious. When they woke up again, Zoe was nowhere to be seen. Frank hurriedly woke Ava, telling her to go to the infirmary to prepare some medicine for protection, but the bizarre events were not over. In the flickering lights, all the cabinet doors in the room suddenly opened, and a corpse was sitting upright, scaring the two into turning and running. Ava was in a panic, and Frank tried to comfort her. She filled the syringe with a deadly poison, but Ava obediently hid, acknowledging that this was her own mistake, and she needed to face everything alone. The roommate in the left wing of the corridor was terrifying, and Frank mustered the courage to approach, claiming he wouldn't harm Zoe. But he forgot that Zoe could read minds. Despite putting down the needle and constantly reassuring Zoe, saying, "We can solve all this, I still love you," Zoe still read her most genuine thoughts from her inner voice. Liars will eventually pay the price for their lies. At the end of the corridor, Ava witnessed everything firsthand, but didn't dare to make a sound. In the gradually dimming lights, Zoe slowly disappeared, injecting all the reserve serum into her body, and undergoing another electric shock, thereby gaining even greater power. Meanwhile, Ava finally decided not to hide anymore. She prepared a large number of syringes, vowing to fight Zoe to the death. At this moment, the two of them were like a bird and a shore, with Zoe's calls sounding like a deathly requiem from a phonograph. Suddenly, Ava reached out to push away the probe, turning her head to see the bouncing ball on the ground. Just as she took out the syringe, she was shocked to see Zoe's inverted figure on the ceiling, resembling a living Madonna. In the scripture, Ava was struck by Zoe into the depths of a nightmare. He finally understood that the little girl in the apartment was a young Zoe, and what he was holding was a box of matches. The truth was revealed. No wonder Zoe had been trapped in this nightmare for decades. It turned out he was the culprit who caused the fire, and it was his weakness back then that led to the tragic death of his family. Helplessly, in the explosive blaze, the burning adult Zoe slowly approached. The pitch-black eyes showed no trace of humanity. Ava could only comfort the young Zoe, saying, "This is not your fault. You can stop all of this. You just need to open the door to find redemption." Encouraged, young Zoe mustered the courage to reach out and open the door. A dazzling holy light poured in, and the nightmare shattered instantly. In reality, the syringe in Ava's hand was firmly injected into Zoe's chest. He finally regained consciousness and kept apologizing to Ava before eventually passing out. The rescue team arrived late, and Ava, who had been holding on all this time, finally broke down and cried uncontrollably. In the dim light, there was no longer any sign of Zuo Yi. The real Zuo Yi was in her arms with the sound of his neck breaking, leading to the annihilation of the entire team. But it doesn't matter. Zuo Yi will use her serum to keep everyone with her forever in another way. This film, Resurrection, is a 2015 sci-fi thriller. And I must say, Movies of this genre from earlier times are indeed captivating. The pacing is very tight, and the ethical and scientific principles behind it are explained thoroughly. The build-up of suspense and the layering of horror elements provide an excellent viewing experience, akin to an escape room under the guise of science fiction. Additionally, the film incorporates the intriguing concept of resurrection. The exploration of science and metaphysics is indeed a key element. However, as the saying goes, if you try to do everything without properly refining the script, you'll end up doing nothing well. Nevertheless, for a low-budget film to achieve this level is commendable. It's quite a pleasant surprise, though it's a pity that there are already similar films like Lucy that set a high standard, making comparisons inevitable. Both explore the ultimate development of the human brain and the acquisition of incredible superpowers. But one leads to nothingness, while the other results in a killing spree. The root cause lies in the traumatic childhood memories, which ultimately lead to the despair of total annihilation. Arthur can't help but wonder if the other team members who haven't experienced Zoe's trauma have their brains fully activated after being resurrected. Would they stand on the opposite side of Zoe and join forces to resist the evil personality?